Hey everybody, welcome back to In Scripture as we continue to look at the Gospel according to Mark. I'm Father Joshua Whitfield at St. Rita Catholic Community here in Dallas. In this episode, we finish up chapter 2 of Mark's Gospel, looking at verses 23 through 28. But as always, let us begin in prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Lord, inspire us to read your Scriptures and to meditate upon them day and night. We beg you to give us real understanding of what we need, that we in turn may put its precepts into practice. Yet we know that understanding and good intentions are worthless unless rooted in your graceful love. So we ask that the words of Scriptures may also be not just signs on a page, but channels of grace into our hearts. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Let us dive into the Scripture right away and read these verses 23 through 28. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, and he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the showbread, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him?" And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." This is the fourth controversy story out of the 5 controversy stories, which, as I've been saying, come one right after the other. These stories in which Jesus gets into dialogue and argument with scribes and Pharisees and Herodians. These are controversy stories which grow more tense. The first 2 stories revolved around questions of forgiveness. Does Jesus, does the Son of Man, have authority to forgive sins? Well, watch me heal this paralytic. Why does Jesus dine with tax collectors and sinners? You know, the controversy surrounding table fellowship. Who belongs into the kingdom, the righteous or also the sinners? There was the question about fasting. Why did the disciples of Jesus not fast? And Jesus gave that very provocative answer. They can't fast because the bridegroom is with them, which of course is very provocative, because the bridegroom in Hebrew, in the imagination of the Hebrew Scriptures, is always God, and here Jesus is likening himself to the bridegroom. And then comes this passage, which raises the issue of the Sabbath. This story and the next, which is connected to it, as we'll see, raise that topic of Jesus' relationship to the Sabbath. It's an issue treated in all of the Gospels, and it was genuinely a controversy that was tense and that ignited violence. It's at the end of the next passage in chapter 3, verse 6, as we'll see, where we get the very first mention of Jesus' opponents plotting to kill him, which is similar to the Gospel of John, where only after he heals the guy on the Sabbath, and then his answer as to why he did that, there in verse 18 of chapter 5 of John's Gospel, you get the very first instance of the desire to kill Jesus, because his response was considered blasphemous. Now, before we dive into the text itself, we should have in mind the bigger picture, and that is Jesus is not anti-Sabbath at all. He never really questions the sacredness of the Sabbath. He goes to synagogue on the Sabbath. His followers seem to respect Sabbath rules. The women, when they visit the tomb in chapter 16, they don't violate the Sabbath in doing that. They wait until the sun goes down. The people who bring their loved ones to Jesus to heal do so when the sun goes down. So it's not the question of whether or not there should be a Sabbath or whether or not the Sabbath is holy. That is an established truth of the faith, which Jesus does not deny. Rather, the question is, what is Jesus' relationship to the Sabbath, which has all sorts of theological and Christological questions that come with that, and then also humans' relationship to the Sabbath, man's relationship to the Sabbath, our relationship to the Sabbath, and Jesus is something of an originalist, as we'll see, on that question. His view of what the Sabbath means and what honoring the Sabbath looks like is radically different than his interlocutors, right? The scribes and the Pharisees. He just has a totally different view of what honoring the Sabbath looks like. So that said, let's dive into the text itself, beginning in verse 23. So he said, one Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. So right off the bat, one Sabbath, Mark's, tipping you off as to what what this story is going to be about, a controversy related to the Sabbath, and so the idea is that Jesus and his disciples are either walking alongside a field or through a field, and they're just grabbing ripe kernels to eat out of their hands, which is perfectly legitimate thing to do. In fact, believe it or not, in Deuteronomy, the law allows for just this action. They would have violated the law had they had a gardening implement, had they had a scythe or something, and if they were actually harvesting this grain, but rather they're just taking it with their hand and eating it along the way. And so it's not the issue of the act itself. The issue is whether or not that act can be interpreted as work, which would violate the Sabbath, which calls into question, Exodus 34, as we'll see. And that was the debate in first century Judaism, or a debate in first century Judaism. That is, if work was prohibited on the Sabbath, well, what constituted work, right? And not everybody agreed. There wasn't a clear menu of this is prohibited, this isn't prohibited, and the rabbis debated and discussed these questions over and over and over again, down to aggravating detail. And so the Pharisees are there, and again, this question: are they there? Are they tracking him? By this time, is it a conceit that the Pharisees, or that Mark mentions the Pharisees, or are the Pharisees just kind of watching them, looking for a way to trip them up, and they see him picking this grain and eating it, and they go, they pick a fight. And so the Pharisees, who for some reason are there and watching, as I just mentioned, they raise the question. There in verse 24. Look, they say, why are they doing what is not lawful in the Sabbath, right? So clearly they think it's a violation of the Sabbath. Now, let's just stop and think about the Sabbath. As I said, Jesus never questions the sacredness of the Sabbath. He's not anti-Sabbath at all. He's just questioning he's just trying to sort of rehabilitate its original purpose. Sabbath in the Jewish mind marked, obviously, God's creation and his rest on the seventh day. And so resting on the Sabbath honored the Creator. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy, we see that the Sabbath also is associated with Israel's liberation from Egypt. And so resting on the Sabbath was, an act which honored, the action of the liberator, right? And the fact that the Hebrews were saved from Egypt, they didn't save themselves. And then also it commemorated the giving of the law at Sinai, if you read Exodus 31. And so the Sabbath, being associated with these foundational acts, going all the way back to creation, marking liberation, marking the establishment of Israel as a people under Torah. These were this belonged to the DNA of the Hebrew people, right? And because of that foundational status of the Sabbath, the laws surrounding it, the violation of the Sabbath, that's why they were so strong, right? That's why it threatened death, execution, exile, and stuff like that. Now the Pharisees, as I said, were likely thinking of Exodus 34, verse 21, where the Sabbath, on the Sabbath, it explicitly mentions a prohibition against plowing, against harvesting, right? And so the Pharisees, watching Jesus and his disciples pick up a few sort of ripe kernels, they interpret that as plowing, right? You kind of get a sense of how tightly wound these people must have been. You can imagine just Jesus just saying, "Are you serious?" But they are, and hence the dialogue which follows. So Jesus, takes the question, and he, like a good rabbi, he answers their question with a question, and it's a very literate question, presuming that they have read. And Jesus says, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, and those who were with him?" He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the showbread, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with them. So verse 25 and 26 make reference to 1 Samuel chapter 21. Now what's interesting, that 1 Samuel chapter 21 is the story of David going to the priest at Nob. This is before the temple was built, so it would have been a tent, David goes by himself and asks for some bread, and the only bread on offer is the showbread, the bread of presence, and he also walks away with the sword of Goliath. Now, there's a few things that are interesting because there's quite a difference between 1 Samuel 21 and the version of it that you get in Mark's gospel. And the first is that in 1 Samuel 21, David is by himself. He's alone. He's not with his men, although he refers to his retinue in that story. Jesus says that David, was there because he was hungry, but this 1 Samuel 21 doesn't mention anything about hunger. Mark 21 Mark chapter 2 here refers to the house of God, but again, this was before the temple was built, so it would have been like a temple. And in 1 Samuel 21, David actually never enters into it. small little detail differences. But the most noticeable difference, and this is what's wound a lot of people up over the centuries, is that in this passage in Mark's Gospel, Jesus refers to Abiathar the priest. But in 1 Samuel 21, it's not Abiathar the priest. Rather, it is Ahimelech, who is Abiathar's father, right? What's the reason for that difference, right? So the name in Mark's account of the story is different than the story in 1 Samuel chapter 21. Jesus names the son, but it's actually the father who deals with David in the original story. So the question, therefore, obviously is what answers for the difference. It is possible, or is it possible? This is the argument. Did Jesus or did Mark just get it wrong, right? Is it that, I often call my own kids the wrong names all the time, right? Is that an instance of Jesus just kind of, he's having to deal with these yahoos to begin with. He gets the name wrong. Is that it? Or did Mark not know what's going on, right? If that's the case, then that raises all sorts of theological questions about Jesus and the Bible itself, and you could see fundamentalists sort of the gears in their brains spinning on how to handle this question. Or, as some suggested, this is another theory which I personally find a bit too clever by half. Did Jesus purposefully say Abiathar, right, knowing that I was wrong? Did he purposely say Abiathar because Abiathar, if you keep reading, in 1 Kings chapter 2, Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, is exiled from the priesthood, right? He's kicked out of the priesthood. Why? Because he refuses to accept Solomon. And Solomon was the rightful son and heir of David, right? Well, here's a story about the son of David being rejected, and so is Jesus, by messing up the names, is Jesus actually sort of making an allusion to Abiathar's priesthood being rejected because he rejected the son of David's heir? Again, I think ultimately that's a nice little theory, which is a bit too clever. I prefer just to not have an answer and to say, that's interesting, curious. I'm going to ask Jesus about that when I see him. But that said, to get too sort of caught up in that question misses the point of the passage entirely. Now, what's interesting, again, just to not lose sight of the main point of the passage, so he refers to Abiathar the high priest and David eating the showbread or the bread of presence, which in Hebrew literally means the bread of the face. The bread of offering, the bread of presence, the showbread, as it's called, is the bread of the face, and it's sort of the ritual symbol of that moment in Exodus 24 when the elders of Israel went a little bit up the mountain of Sinai and ate and drank in God's presence, and they held him, right? So this is very, very special bread, like 12 loaves of specially baked bread that was set before the temple on the Sabbath, right? And only the priests could eat it, right? Now, again, there might be some elusive work going on here, in the sense that if Jesus is telling the story, maybe he is suggesting that the disciples of Jesus, being disciples of the Son of David, like David and his disciples, eat bread which was reserved for the priesthood. Why? Because they are priests to Again, that's sort of stretching the illusion maybe a bit too much. But it is interesting to think about. Another sort of big picture point is here is Jesus comparing his situation to a situation that David was in, right? So he's likening himself to David, he being, as Luke makes out quite clearly, the son of David. So moving on to verse 27, we get to the moral of the story, right? And he said to him, verse 27, he said to him, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And then might as well finish verse 28. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, right? Now, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now that's not, Jewish teaching accepts that, right? Jesus is not saying anything sort of radically new here. And as we'll see, Jesus is something of, I use the word originalist, when it comes to the place and the purpose of the Sabbath, right? The Sabbath is this sort of ritual participation in man's communion and harmony with God, right? And that includes justice. It includes healing. It includes mercy. And so Jesus is saying that any act of mercy, any act of human flourishing cannot by itself be a violation of the Sabbath, right? Because the Sabbath is meant to serve man, not man serve the Sabbath, right? And we'll see this later on in Mark's Gospel when Jesus talks about parents' relationship or children's relationship with their parents and things like that, other questions related to justice. And we'll see it again explicitly in the next few verses when we dive into chapter 3. But then we move on to this other sort of phrase in verse 28. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, just to sort of put it within context of Matthew's Gospel. So far in Matthew's Gospel, we've seen Jesus as presented to be the strong one, right? Again, the fulfillment of Exodus chapter 40, verse 10, right? The strong one who tends his flock like a shepherd, right? Here's the strong, and he speaks with exousia, with authority, right? And his words are so powerful that he can call his disciples. He can tell demons to shut up. He can speak healing. He is the powerful one with authority. He is Lord over the demonic realm, over the created realm, right? He is the strong one. But then we have the story that sort of likens Jesus to David, and it's capped off with this phrase "Son of Man," which is Jesus' favorite sort of title for himself, especially in Mark's Gospel, which is elusive of Daniel chapter 7, right? If you go back to read Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man is this sort of messianic figure for whom the Ancient One of Days will hand over dominion, right? So you get packed up all at once, the idea of Jesus as Son of David, as strong one, as Son of Man, human, but also sort of messianic Daniel 7 type figure, who is Lord not just over sickness, not just over the spiritual realm, but even over the Sabbath, right? And so we just get another sort of another way to look at Jesus subtly in this passage. The Davidic theme, right, is added to the Son of Man theme, is added to the Strong One theme, right? And so we're getting this sort of dynamic picture that's taking shape about who this Jesus is, right? And it's because he is all of that, because he is the fulfillment of Daniel 7, because he's the fulfillment of Isaiah 40, with exousia, authority. Because of all that, one, he can certainly eat grains of corn walking through a field. But more than that, he is the Messiah, right? Now, this is the first sort of Sabbath controversy that we get in Mark's gospel. And, clearly Jesus' response is, hey, I'm like David. In John, it's the stakes are even higher in the first Sabbath controversy that you come across in that gospel. And in chapter 5 of John's gospel, Jesus heals this guy on the Sabbath, right? And people challenge him, why do you do that on the Sabbath? And Jesus' answer is, my Father goes on working and so do I. Which makes him want to kill him, right? Now, the reason that was such a provocative response is because, and we're talking about John 5 here, is because in the Hebrew mind, everything rests on the Sabbath. Everything rests on the Sabbath, except the forces of life, which God controls, and God himself, right? So the sun still rises, animals still give birth on the Sabbath, right? Because that's God's prerogative. That's God's work, right? Which continues. And so for Jesus to say, my Father goes on working and so do I, he is calling himself the Son, right? He's calling himself the Son. He is, and that's why there in verse 17 and 18 of chapter 5 of John's Gospel, they immediately get what he's saying, and they think he's being blasphemous, and they start thinking about killing him, right? And so in John's Gospel, the first Sabbath controversy is related to the Son's relationship to the Father, right? Jesus in that controversy story is using it as an opportunity to say to the people, I am the Son of the Father. I am one with the Father, as they'll say explicitly in chapter 10 of John's Gospel. Here in Mark, in this Sabbath story, it's not that theological, right? Jesus is sticking to the themes of being the Son of Man, the Son of David, sticking to these allusions to Isaiah 40 and Daniel chapter 7, and so on and so forth. But that's all we have for this passage. We will dive into chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 next time, which are really, that passage is really an illustration of what Jesus was saying in verse 27 of chapter 2. So until then, I'll see you around. Bye.